Good morning. Today is the first Sunday in Advent, and the Gospel lectionary text comes from Luke chapter 21, verses 25 to 36. The lectionary system has been in place going all the way back to the early church, certainly in the 3rd century and forward, and it's the texts that are given to the church globally to preach on. It's a good discipline, so we're going to use that this year. And this is the Gospel lectionary text from Luke chapter 21, verses 25 to 36. And there will be signs in sun, moon, and stars, and upon the earth, distress of nations in perplexity at the roaring of the sea and the waves. People fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, when these things begin to take place, look up, raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing nigh. And he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree, and look at all the trees. As soon as they come out with leaves, the summer's already near. So also, you see for yourselves and know that when you see these things taking place, you know that the reign of God is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all this has taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and anxieties of this life, and that day come upon you suddenly like a trap. For it will come upon all who dwell upon the face of the whole earth. But watch at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that will take place, and to stand before the Son of Man. That concludes the reading for the day. Any given sermon on any given Sunday, if it's authentic, does not preach timeless truths. Any given sermon on any given Sunday is the value of that sermon is only for that Sunday. It speaks the word of God to the contemporary church. And it's the same with this particular sermon here today. It speaks to our contemporary situation. You know, this is really a story about frogs and water. Of course, you know the myth, and it is a myth. It's not reality, but the myth is that if you put frogs in tepid water and put them on the stove and boil them, they will get used to the temperature of the water until they're cooked. And it's not true. You know, if you put a frog in boiling water, immediately it will jump out to save its own skin. Now, that's the myth. However, behind the myth is a tale of the human condition. You can put a human being into any situation, and as that situation gets worse and worse and worse, that human being will go further and further and further into denial. Denial's not simply the longest river in the world. It is precisely the human problem. And so what we want to do is we want to ask ourselves about this apocalyptic text and why Christendom is in such denial about it, and it is in quite a bit of denial about what the text is actually communicating. So what we want to do is we want to say, okay, how can we engage in a denial reading of this text, what it's really saying? Well, the way the conservatives do it is they have their physical rapture theory. They get to escape. It's their theological escape clause, this business of the rapture, which anybody who's done any serious study well knows that that is just a concocted bit of fantasy created out of whole cloth by John Darby and C.I. Scofield and Clarence Larkin and others. But it's a way of denying the impact of the text, because the text is saying all this is coming, and you can go, oh, I get to go out of here. I got my ticket. I'm going to get raptured. I'm not going to experience this. And the text never goes there. In fact, the text makes very clear everybody's going to go through this, the whole world. And the question is, who will stand before the Son of Man? at the end who will be there. The liberals have another way to deal with this. That's basically to absolutely, in their rationality, do a form of escapism. I call it rational rapture. And that's where they go, oh, obviously, you know, this is a fake worldview, you know, stars don't fall from skies, and there won't be these terrible things out there planetarily or astronomically. And all of this, you know, is kind of like legendary. And then they'll jump into all the, did the historical Jesus say this, yada, yada, yada. And then they would also come to the text, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory, and they go, oh, no, 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 you know, there's no return of Christ. Or they'll do like so many of our friends do, and they'll want to make the return of Christ at Pentecost or the return of Christ at AD 70 and the alleged, you know, no moral covenant stuff, the new covenant people that do all this strange stuff. However they do it, what they're denying is a reality that's coming to shape the entire planet. And that's the coming of the true human, the coming of the Son of Man. We as a species have been evolving for a long, long, long time. And in that evolutionary process, we have bent and broke and messed ourselves up so bad that it took a redeemer to come and show us the way out of this thing that we call culture and religion, civilization. And Luke 21 is absolutely apropos in terms of where we are at as an American culture. And if you're outside of America today, you'll have to kind of translate this into your own culture. I'm only thinking of American culture. But in America today, we see an absolute fascination with apocalypse. And it's a long time coming. I mean, it comes out of the revivalist thinking and tent meetings and prophecy tent meetings of the 1900s across America. And with this rise of dispensationalist fundamentalism at the turn of the 20th century and its impact in all manner of fundamentalist prophecy conferences for the next 40, 50 years, that along with 2 world wars, because this Christian thing didn't work out the way people thought it would work out, has brought us to where we have been absolutely fascinated with the apocalypse since the culture wars of the 1960s, going back into the 1950s with sci-fi, going all the way back into the 19th century with Jules Verne and the invasion of the planet by aliens. And you can go from Jules Verne's Aliens, plural, to Ridley Scott's Alien, singular, and you can see a culture that's absolutely fascinated with this end of the world kind of thinking. It's the end of the world. American films, zombies, the Earth getting wiped out by asteroids, and Bruce Willis's Armageddon. There's the Deep Freeze film with Dennis, I want to say, I forget his last name, the actor, Day After Tomorrow. There are natural disaster films like 2012 with John Cusack. There's disease films like Outbreak. There's madman with power money scenarios like we saw in all the James Bond films. You know, there's this fascination with apocalyptic and the end of the world. It's always the end of the world. But there's just also another great big denial about this because of the influence of what can only be called cultural Darwinism. That is, that the world's getting better and better, and it's that progressive view of history found in the 19th century. One would think that the 20th century would have absolutely tempered cultural Darwinism and the belief that the human species is getting better. In fact, this text is telling us we are not getting better. We are getting worse. Yes, there is a change coming. Yes, that change is for the better, in a sense, if you want to use this language. But the change itself is traumatic. And the human species is about to experience that trauma. So when we talk about apocalypse, all we have to do simply is think about the realities that science has placed before us with regard to climate change, rising of sea levels, knowing that 70% of the people on the planet live on the coastlines. You talk about refugee and homelessness problems when the seas rise. The melting of the polar ice caps and icebergs calving off Antarctica. The strength now and of the growing strength of things like hurricanes, monsoons, earthquakes, fires. I mean, we are seeing nature herself, the natural planet itself, herself, racked with tribulations in this sense. Human caused? Probably. Other things factor in? Probably. But the reality is, we look at 2050, and those that do the kinds of demographic work that project that there will be 9 billion people on the planet, and that's unsustainable. It's we're not sustainable at this point at 7 billion people. Can you imagine adding another 30%, 25, 30% to the planet right now in terms of mouths to feed, jobs to create? Folks, it doesn't take great imagination to know that the world is in turmoil. We have watched America go into the throes of a turmoil she has not seen since the 1960s, and whose only other marker in her history for the kind of turmoil she's in is the Civil War of 1860 to 64. We are a culture in crisis. And why? Well, the Lucan text is going to explain this. But before it does, and I just want to give you also a background in this, we have to remember the worldview that dominated a significant part of Jesus' Judaism in one form or another. And that's the dualism of Judaism after the exile under the influence of Zoroaster, and the following of Zoroaster and the creation of essentially two gods, one good, one evil, although in Judaism, God had authority over the Satan. And you had the myth of thus the fall of the Satan in the Hanukkah literature, and we talk about the Hanukkah worldview, or the First Enoch worldview. It's my general description for a way of thinking in Second Temple Judaism that dominated the minds of many. And in Second Temple Judaism, when it comes to the end time, you know, where rather than zombies and aliens, they have demons and angels. They also have natural disasters and mad rulers, lots of mad rulers, Gentile armies, and messianic figures, saviors like Neo and Luke Skywalker. You see, this myth, this Hanukkah myth, permeates Christendom just as much as it permeated Second Temple Judaism, and through Christendom now permeates the arts, the film industry, and its understanding of angels and demons in heaven and hell. And it also explains why you have so many movies in the last 20, 30, 40 years where evil wins as the result of the deconstruction of Christianity and the deconstruction of the Deus Ex Machina. And that is particularly evident in the incredible and best apocalyptic film out there, The Cabin in the Woods. And I will leave that for now because I've got to carry on. Now, apocalypse as a category is always going to contain three elements. One, it finds the problem of evil in the supernatural, thus the fall of the good angel Lucifer, who becomes Satan. Although it's actually the other way around. Satan of the Christian tradition becomes Lucifer of the Middle Ages. Second, apocalypse always divides persons into those who align with evil and those who align with good. Again, it's that notion of the two ways that one finds in the Jewish wisdom tradition, now apocalyptically expressed with regard to the end of time and where you end up in the judgment scenario and the resurrection of the dead. And third, there's always a day of judgment and recompense in apocalyptic literature. No matter how the end is conceived, it's always conceived in terms of judgment and recompense. Now, Luke is using Mark's apocalypse, Mark 13, and we really only have two apocalypses in the New Testament, Mark 13 and the book of the Revelation. Those are the only two we have. Matthew and Luke will use Mark, so we only have two. And there will, of course, midrash or expand or edit, do redacting work there with Mark 13 in their own text, which is Matthew 24 and Luke 21. But you only have this bare bones, as it were, end-time eschatology in the New Testament. It's reflected, of course, in the little letter of Jude. You can find it there. You can also find it in 2 Peter chapter 2, because 2 Peter chapter 2 actually incorporates the letter of Jude minus the pseudepigraphal material. You can find it as well in Paul's earliest letters before he makes his break with the Jerusalem church, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And it's important to note that you don't find that kind of thinking in Paul's later letters. So while we have this apocalyptic text for this Sunday, we want to keep in mind that this frame that we think we've been given by the church with regard to apocalyptic, the Second Temple Henochic worldview, has been completely subverted by the gospel, and that's the point of the New Testament. It will be a point that Luke is going to make here in this text for us. We see it in Paul and in the writer of the fourth gospel. Those two writers absolutely designate the apocalyptic event as the crucifixion. That is the apocalypse. That is the unveiling. That is where God is known. That's what apocalypse means, to unveil, to reveal that which is revealed, that which is known. And God is known for Paul and the writer of the fourth gospel only through the crucified. So we don't want to make the mistake of assuming that Jesus has some kind of Second Temple Henochic worldview, nor do we want to make the mistake that Luke does as well, nor do we want to fall into the trap of that kind of embedded Second Temple worldview in both liberalism, conservatism, Catholicism, Protestantism, and everywhere else. It's time to put that to rest. The writers of the New Testament did. So when we come to a text like this, we have a number of particular things we're looking for. One, the Markan composition is written as Jerusalem is falling. Now, we've noted in talks in the classroom of the Duda Theology, where I do other theological work, the importance of the temple narrative and how that shapes and frames so much of what's happening in the New Testament. Okay? The destruction of the temple in 70 CE was huge. It seems to me to be fairly certain that the historical Jesus announced that as the consequence of the people's rejection of his message of peace and forgiveness. The only thing that their zealotry, their holiness codes, their litmus tests, and everything else could lead to would be the destruction of their religion. He understood that. I think he makes that clear in his teachings, not only in his prophetic act in the temple, but also his rejection of economies of exchange. You see this shot through the Jesus tradition. This text, Luke 21, just right before our text, specifically references this fall when it refers to Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. That's exactly how it went down. Even though Luke is redacting, Mark, who's writing shortly after the event, Luke's redacting this perhaps a decade or 15 years later, he is, in fact, talking about the historical phenomenon of Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem. Now, folks, when you're surrounded by armies, that means there's no supply chain. Your ability to receive food, weapons, help, and support is completely cut off. And that's the beginning of the end, when you're surrounded, when you're outflanked. One of the more interesting facets of going to Gettysburg is to walk around Big Round Top and Little Round Top and remember the main regiment that came around on that July 3rd, 2nd, 3rd, 4th battle and that outflanked the South. Very important. And here, Rome has outflanked Jerusalem. Now, Luke is writing this 15 years later, Rabbi Yohan ben Zakkai is already working with rabbis seeking to reconstruct Judaism in a post-temple period. We know that Matthew's community has wrestled with its identity. Oh, I should say we know. Those of us in the classroom of the Deuterotheology know, where I've been exploring this. We know that Matthew's community has wrestled with Judaism. Here, what Luke has done is he said, look, the rejection of the message of peace is going to lead to the destruction of your religion. And then Luke carries this further, following the Markan narrative, and refers to the times of the Gentiles. That's where he has this phrase earlier in the text, that all this is going to take place till the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. The times of the Gentiles, folks, is what we've been in for 2,000 years. The logic of the Lucan text is that just as Jesus' message of peace and forgiveness was rejected by his contemporaries and their religion, so when Jesus' message of peace and forgiveness is rejected by our Christian contemporaries, and it is, then the only thing that can happen is the destruction of their religion, the fall of their religion. This text is heralding not just simply the end of the human species, but the end of Christendom itself. There are intimations of this in the Markan text that Luke doesn't follow with regard to false messiahs coming, fake Christianities. There are, as a second historical consideration to take into account here, Luke is not only describing Jerusalem being surrounded, and then we're going to come to, in a sense, this planetary surrounding, earthquakes, stars from the sky falling. We've moved from the local to the global here in the Lucan narrative, although our lectionary is just on the global. Not only do we have this historical fall connected with the larger rejection of Jesus, and as I point out in the classroom, I follow David Mosner's thesis here that Luke uses a particular form of the Mosaic narrative, the story about Moses, as the rejected prophet theme that runs through his central travel narrative. But here's the other thing. You'll notice in this apocalypse, God isn't mentioned as the cause of any of this. God is not doing any of this. It's all natural. Well, what is happening here is that we are dealing with a symbolic universe that ties in the destruction that the human species causes with its war and its greed. That's why there's going to be famines. Famines don't occur because there's not enough food anymore. Famines occurs because of distribution systems. There's enough food to feed everybody. It's the distribution issue. We humans are the proximate cause of all this in this text. And these great upheavals that we are going to experience as our religion comes to its end, as it reaches its climax point, as it's going to expose the true human, it will go through terror. And this is what people are experiencing. When they read the news, you can see the anxiety on Facebook everywhere. There's an interesting thing that occurs here in the text. It's an interesting verb when Jesus says, there will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and upon the earth distress of nations and perplexity at the roaring of the sea and the waves. Why in the world are the oceans rising? In the RSV reads, men fainting with fear. Apasuko means that you can't breathe, you stop breathing. This is a note that I. Howard Marshall makes in his commentary, which is, I think, worth observing. This is a take your breath away moment. It's like when you're watching the movie 2012 or any other apocalyptic movie, and that big event starts to happen, man, and it's just like, it's a take that kind of a moment, man. And some of you've been in environments where things are those takeaway moments. My closest would be standing outside the Real Estate Training Center in Bayside, Queens, watching the sky fill up, the Manhattan skyline fill up with smoke on 9/11. You know, it's a breathtaking. It's a turning point moment. You know you're in it. Well, folks, the turning point is come. Scientists have already warned us about the tipping points with regard to climate change, but there are also tipping points in our sociology, in our ability to contain violence. The fact is, the gospel is destroying the mechanism that allows us to do that. The sacrificial mechanism is breaking down. It's not working anymore. Without scapegoats, it can't work. It doesn't work. We keep on trying it, but it doesn't work. We have to find someone to blame, but it isn't working. There's no global unanimity. Scapegoating only works when there's unanimity, and the gospel has broken that down. We see that in both sides in America right now, the right and the left calling each other scapegoaters, and both of them calling themselves the victims of the other. The total lack of undifferentiation predicted by Nietzsche over 100 years ago. We live in truly turbulent times. Turba, the Latin word for mob. We live in mob times. Everything's about likes on Facebook, likes on Twitter. Everything's about getting an audience, climbing the ladder, being better, making better, be best. That's life today. And the struggle is real. And people are perplexed. And what do? We drown our sorrows. We deny them. It's easy to go to a bar. I did that for a decade. I know what it's like to drink your pain away. You can look back and say, man, that was stupid. That was a colossal waste of time and money. You can say everything you want about it. But we have a million ways of denying our pain in the United States of America. And all of them are addictions in one form or another. And here Jesus says, take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life. Now listen very carefully here. I want you to understand, there's no substantive difference between shooting yourself up with a needle, drinking a bottle of scotch, and worrying. They all belong together. They're all ways of dealing with the pain of life. And Jesus says, if you're focused on your worries, you're no different than the drunk. That's the same thing the drunk is focused on, his worries. He's finding another way to numb them. You numb them by worrying about them, as though you can control them or change the past. You can't. I think it's very important here that cares of this life, the worries of this life, is tied in with things like drunkenness. I mean, the moral judgments that the pious make that worry about life against the drunks, we've got to save them. I think we need to start going into the churches and saving all these Christians that are worried about life. Don't you? Sure. We'll have ministries to them. He says, look, if you're caught up in these things, if that's what you're aware of, if you're only aware of your own pain, if that's all you're aware of is your own pain, and so you're handling it this way or that way, that's all you're aware of, your worries, you're only aware of your own pain. If that's all you're aware of, you're not going to be aware of what's happening around you. And if you're not aware of what's happening around you, you're not going to be able to play in the game. And that's the message for Christianity today. Are you aware of what's going on around you, or are you focused only on your own pain? Where are you focused? Are you focused on the reality of the events of culture and civilization breaking down? of Christianity as a religion undergoing a great turmoil. One would like to call it almost a purification. One would like to. Can you see that at the end of this crisis comes something beneficial, an apolutrosis, a redemption for which we are to raise our heads, because we know that when there is great suffering, the true human is revealed. We've seen that in Calvary. And we know that when great suffering comes upon the human species, Jesus will be vindicated again. Just as he was vindicated when the Father raised him from the dead, just as he was vindicated when he was seated at the right hand of the Father and given the name above all names. He will be vindicated again. Now the text reads with that language, they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. I don't think we should interpret this in terms of Rambo Jesus or Che Guevara Jesus if you're a progressive Christian. I think we need to see very clearly that this is that Danielic reference to the Ancient of Days, the true human, the one who is revealed as Jesus of Nazareth, the nonviolent, non-retributive preacher of the kingdom or the reign of God's good grace and light and love. That's who's returning. The same Jesus yesterday, today, and forever, as the writer of Hebrews says, not a different Jesus, not a different dispensation, but this same Jesus that in this text has already healed lepers as signs of the coming kingdom of God in chapter 17. We have in this text an encouragement to hope. Yes, the shit is going to hit the fan, people. Yes, it is. And it's our task to get the church or Christians or followers of Jesus ready for that, so that when the time comes, we will be those who stand against the violent oppressors with nonviolence, who stand against the retributive with forgiveness, who stand against the war makers and warmongers and the gang leaders and everybody else with peace. And will we give our lives? We well may. But we will bear witness. We will be that last shining testimony of the true human. We will be the return of the Son of Man, corporately. That is our hope, the redemption, the great gift that God has given to the cosmos will become a reality. And it only becomes a reality when we acknowledge the extremity of our situation, the extreme fear, the fact that the human species is on a broken roller coaster, and we're about to see the train hit that part of the tracks where the bridge is blown. That's the direction we're headed. There's an inevitability to it. We went through a major cataclysm twice in the 20th century, in World War I and World War II. That's not the end. That's just the beginning. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, Jesus says it's just the beginning. Look around, be realistic, but don't be hopeless. The change is coming. Your redemption draws nigh. And you are part of that. You are the strong ones. You are those who have the courage to make peace with enemies, to forgive those who hurt you, to love the unlovely. You are those in this text that will be the true human, the revelation of the true human. You will be that body. So be of good cheer, little flock. Our task is to walk this path through this apocalypse to the unveiling of Christ again at the Calvary of the human species. How shall we then live? We need to avoid escapism and hedonism and the worries of this life. I can't say this enough. I find both the Christian right and the Christian left to indulge far too much in hedonism. far too focused on the pleasures of life. And there are great pleasures in life to be had. And when you're suffering and in pain, there's nothing like a pleasure to cheer you up. But it can't be the be-all and end-all. And it too often is for the Christian in America. We have to avoid escapism, hedonism, and the worries of this life. We've got to learn to be those people that trust our Papa. That's who we are. We have to ask, where is our awareness focused? Is it focused on ourselves and our pain? Take heed lest your hearts be weighed down. Are we just focused on ourselves and how much we hurt? Or are we looking at the big picture and our role in it? Finally, will the true human find trust on earth when he returns? Or will he find Christians being like the importunate widow who begs and begs and pleads and believes she has to badger the judge before anything gets done? The Father's not like that. And Jesus wants to know at the end of that parable, will the Son of Man find trust on the earth when he returns? Will there be that kind of trust, or will we have fallen into the trap of believing in a sky God rather than a crucified God? Thus endeth the lesson for today. Thanks for joining me. You're always welcome to join us for more in the classroom of the Duda Theology. And if you're interested in subscribing, I will put the link there each Sunday when I preach. I'll look forward to seeing you next Sunday when we do Luke chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Peace and love. Happy Advent.